A very good evening and welcome to tonight's episode of On the Record. My name is Vuyo Mbogo. On tonight's show, well, today marks the start of the Israeli Apartheid Week in South Africa, where activists who have aligned themselves with the Palestinian cause will be spending the week drawing attention to the plight of Palestinians. Well, my guests are coming from the opposite sides of the debate. But first, of faith and frauds. The person who's going to join me this evening has been involved in a probe into some of the complaints her commission continues to receive concerning certain churches and their practices. Well, in case you haven't noticed, it's getting ridiculous by the day. In the latest incident this past weekend, a KwaZulu-Natal pastor, Thamsanqa Sambulo, was pictured pouring just boiled water on congregants' hands, all in a supposed demonstration of a faith by a man who calls himself the Son of God. The latest episode follows a string of others that have included grass and snake eating and petrol drinking. Tonight we speak to someone who's been engaging some of the characters responsible for these deeds and ask, how worse must it get before anyone can put an end to this? What kinds of people engage in such outrageous forms of behavior? Well, Toko Mkhwanazi is the chairperson of the Commission for the Protection and Promotion of Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Communities. She has spent the past couple of years looking into these issues. Welcome, Mama, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
I want you to take us back to when the hearings started. Into what necessitated them. Now, that's the background to what we've been seeing over the past year or so.
What really triggered our investigation, it's an investigative study, was what was out there, what was in the media. But we also noticed that there was a sudden resurgence or new churches that were starting up, and they were starting up fast and furious. And we also noticed that most of them were not registered. Most of the pastors were doing miracles and unusual work. So we decided last year as the Sarah Rights Commission, which were relatively a new commission at the time because commissions go in 5 years. So we're in our second year. And we said, let's look at what is happening out there. Hence, we said it's an investigative study. We had received complaints, but we knew there are other people who might not complain, who might just be going through this. The media might not find them. So we needed to go out there on a random sample and see what comes out. We started this process in October last year, where we started inviting different church leaders, different religions. We spoke to Jewish people, we spoke to Islamic people, we spoke to Hindus. So it's not only just Christianity, but I'm sure the media is caught up with a whole range of Christian pastors because there was drama there as opposed to the other religions that came forward and there was nothing to write home about. But since October to this time of the year, we were also surprised. We knew there was a problem, but we went in naively thinking, these are people of God, they can only, go up to a point and no more.
Well, 6 months down the line, you've discovered some, shall we say, really weird characters and deeds.
We've discovered some of the most unusual things, and we've seen what we never thought we would see. People who say, the Holy Spirit said I must make them eat grass. God said, let them eat snakes. Others who say we're angels directly from heaven. We just came here to catch Satan. Some say all sorts of other things. We've discovered that the issue of, what they call faith products, it's a multi-million rand industry. Some of the pastors tell us, I make R1 million a month selling faith products because supposedly they are healing. So people are spending a lot of money. Some of them are selling their houses, putting their houses up for sale to hand over to the pastor who has promised them a better return on their investment. They take their pensions, take them straight to the pastor who said, we'll multiply this by 10. So
we're talking about pyramid schemes.
At least the pyramid scheme, someone benefits. Those that come in early get something out of the system. But what we've realized is that
nothing
pastors claim,
out.
Of course, if they claim to be curing AIDS, to be curing high blood pressure, you don't need to take your chronic medication, just buy water from me and you'll be healed. My t-shirt cures everything. And you see, what we've been shocked about is the gullibility of our people. You know, people just buy into anything. Because sometimes it's too good to be true. You know, you see it coming there. We've also been looking at traditional healers during the same period. People, you know, when you look at the newspapers, you know, at the end, the classified ads will tell you, you know, a Togolosho will come and give you 1.8 million rands every morning. And you know, for someone to believe that, it's a level of desperation that we never thought existed. So the issue of unemployment, poverty and inequality pushes people to have those dreams. And if my children are unemployed, and if I want a bigger house and I want to move out of my poverty, I'm very much likely to be exploited because I'm desperate.
Is it, well, some of us are sort of have formed impressions of these gullible people. We are assuming that these are poor people who are less educated than many people. And we are also assuming that they will have a problem of one kind or the other that will sort of get them closer to this sort of... Is that what you've discovered?
Economics will tell you can't make R1 million a month out of poor people. Some of the people who have come to complain to us are very educated, highly educated people. In a point of desperation, maybe you want that tender, you want that big thing. Poor people can only give you so much money up to a point. Some of them are on the grant or they are on a living wage. It's the big fish, like you and I, who pay good money, who have a house to sell for R5 million, who have a pension to cash. You know, it's those types of people who are more likely to pay more money to keep the system rolling, as opposed to only poor people. Of course, poor people are also, you know, victims. But for you to be a serious victim, it's that,
you have to.
Yes, it's that feeling of, Vuyo got the tender and I might get even a bigger tender.
The question I guess many people have been asking is, what needs to happen to put a stop to this? Because I think from, the work you've done over the past 6 months, there is clear evidence here of all the things that you've just mentioned. What needs to happen?
What needs to happen is that this sector needs to be regulated. You see, lawyers have lawyers society, everybody's regulated. Some peer review needs to be there. Other people are experts in the religion, whether it's whatever kind of religion, whether it's Christianity, etc. They need to sit around the table. First of all, for you to be a pastor, we truly believe you must apply somewhere, explain yourself, and be interviewed somewhere. Then you are issued with a license to operate. The other issue is that there must be basic training. You know, you can have a calling. You can have a calling as a doctor, but you don't open up a surgery the next day. You go through some training. So there must be basic training, not necessarily a degree, but people need to understand the legalities that if you are running a church, you must register and you must have financial statements.
But will that necessarily solve the problem? The reason I'm asking is that you've had your Anglicans and Methodists and, you know, or what have you, who have been there for as long as you and I can remember.
Yes.
Right? But they never covered themselves in glory either. Because if you look at the systems that they've practiced, I mean, go back to, who supported a church in large numbers. Our people, poor as they were, continued to give money to those churches to build white churches first, or better white churches than the churches they were building in the townships. And the priests and bishops and archbishops who followed the white folk came into the system, never really reformed it, certainly not to the desired extent. So they too have their own history. And when these new churches come, it goes without saying that they're going to be jealous of them. They're going to see these young fellows making lots and lots of money, and they're going to object to their existence. Yes, these new fellows are not covering themselves in glory either, because of the snakes and the grass and the petrol and everything that goes with that. But there is a reality, there is a jealousy between these two camps, if we may call it that. So how do you make sure that those who are going to come in and regulate are not going to favor the old folks who are not innocent or as clean either?
You need to have a tight regulation, and you need to make sure that people who sit around the table are not from one system. They must be diverse in terms of charismatic churches, etc., etc. But as you rightfully say, no one is as clean as they come. Even the issue of commercialization, we may be talking about people who are selling water and T-shirts, but even your traditional churches are in the habit of saying if you want umanyano to wear umanyano, you have to pay something like 500 rands a month, or else take off that jacket. That for me is pure commercialization, because as an old woman, I might not have 500 rands out of my grant, but I also want to be identified as umama umanyano. And if it costs money, and we've had complaints, direct complaints of people who say, Ugogo has been asked to take off her manyano blouse because she hasn't paid the 500 rands. That is more painful actually than someone buying water, because water is optional. If this is the only uniform I have to go to church and you're telling me I must take it off, what am I supposed to wear to go to church? That is even worse than the option to buy a T-shirt. So as you rightfully say, we need a system that will be tightly monitored. We need a system that will vigorously defend the religion itself and not allow, so no one is as clean as they come, what we've discovered. We've discovered that the system itself needs to be regulated, it needs to be monitored, but we also as a nation need to start asking ourselves the difficult question, how did we get here? Why did we do nothing over the past 10, 15 years? Where were we, all of us, as this was happening? Because a lot of harm has happened, and we're going to go to Parliament in April and say to Parliament, this is urgent, it cannot wait.
Well, I'm going to ask you to answer that very question. Where have we been? And whether, in fact, there is an appetite among those who have the power to actually do something about what, from where some people sit, is actually a crisis and a tragedy waiting to happen. That's after this short ad break.
Technology isn't all scary. There's also fun stuff like gaming.
Lots of women do play games, whether it's on their phones or their tablets.
Then there are Africans who are using new tools to make other people's lives much easier.
We typed the whole CV on a small, QWERTY Nokia phone.
For all these and other technology and social media news, join me, Spumelele Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Central African Time on SABC News.
Molemo, when pregnant with her first daughter, Relebogile knew that she wanted her daughter not to experience any identity issues. This is when she decided to look for toys that resembled Black as Beautiful.
I think for me, it was also just to get our girls to have some sense of identity, some sense of belonging.
I grew up having black and white dolls, and going to a multiracial school, I did not really see color. So for me, it's this thing of she should actually know what her true identity is.
Join your host Puleng Mulebati on Bupilong every Friday at 17:30.
Welcome back. You're watching on the record, and tonight we're talking about some of the most ridiculous incidents we have seen in recent times. This past weekend, alone, a KwaZulu-Natal pastor was pictured pouring just boiled water on congregants' hands, all in a supposed demonstration of faith by a man who calls himself the Son of God. I guess, do we have to wait until you go back to Parliament before anything? Can there be no interim measures put in place right now to say we need to put a stop to this madness?
You see, legally speaking, there's no legal framework in this country that says to people, you can't do this. There isn't even one that says you have to register your church. So right now, people are doing whatever they want to do, but we have warned them. Even with the angels, from the angels ministry who have said children shouldn't go to school. It's an illegal operation because really, constitutionally, children have a right to go to school. So those rights are being abused, and we are going to be saying there needs to be consequences because those children have lost their lives. Some of them are 20 years old. The one who complained is 24 years old now. He's never been to school. So those lives have already been wasted, and it's going to be very hard to claw back those years. So we're saying we're brave enough to say Parliament is ready to listen. We've been talking to them about this is what we're discovering, this is what is happening. And I'm sure parliamentarians are also seeing what is out there. And I think in the past 6 months, what we've been able to do is to make people sit and watch what is out there, to hear from the men of God themselves what they claim. Because if we're telling the story ourselves, people would think, yeah, she must be making up half of it. But, you know, fiction would be much stranger than reality, to tell you the honest fact. We're still in shock. But I think what we need to do, we cannot wait. We have pushed this thing through. Mid-April, we're tabling the report to Parliament, and we're praying and hoping that Parliament will give it the urgency it deserves. This cannot go on anymore.
From the conversations you've had with the legislators, do they have a grasp of the, how serious the problem is, and did you get a sense that they have the will to actually act and make things happen?
I think they have a will to change the system. We believe there will be resistance. We've seen resistance. A lot of pastors are saying they don't want to be regulated. And I think it shouldn't be up to them what needs to happen. As a nation, we need to take very difficult decisions and walk through. Because it's a matter of we cannot go this route. And if we think we can cajole people and beg them and pray and hope that sanity will prevail, it's just going to go worse. It's going to get worse because they've realized that, okay, so everybody knows what we're doing. Now, what are they going to do?
It's an election year, and we've seen how politicians go to churches these days to mobilize people. Do you think that's going to play any
I think
role?
The millions of us, we need to hold politicians accountable. It's the minority. They can't please minority pastors at the expense of millions of Christians who want to defend the religion itself.
But what but if the most recent trends are anything to go by, politicians have actually been going to the sort of churches that we are talking about. Those pastors and prophets are actually the ones who have been officiating at some of the parties' gigs, rallies.
You say this is the second struggle. We believe as the Civil Rights Commission that we cannot back down now. The country needs us to defend. We were set up by the Constitution to promote and protect the rights of cultural, religious and linguistic communities. It would mean they are frowning upon the Constitution if they say, just hang in there, the elections are around the corner, we'll deal with it after. Because it's not constitutionally sound, but it's also not morally sound, really.
Well, I wish you all the best.
Thanks a lot. I think we need
much
prayers.
For joining us this evening. Well, that's where we're going to leave this particular issue. Up next, we're talking about Israel, the Israel-Palestine question, and my guests are people who are lobbying for both sides of the divide, and they'll be telling us why and whether you and I can play a role in ensuring that peace eventually comes to that region, which for decades now has been battling with violence, destruction, and everything that goes with that. That's after this short ad break.
SABC News. We report, contextualize and present news and current affairs honestly, fairly and fully. We consider it a duty to provide consistent, relevant, useful and top quality information and analysis. Our mission is to provide credible, accurate and interesting news programming, bringing news into everyone's homes in everyone's languages. Thank you, South Africa, for relying on SABC News for quality news output and for making us your #1 source of information. SABC News, Africa's news leader.
A very good afternoon. You're watching the Midday Report.
Lunchtime news amplified.
But for now, this is what they call home. Their hope to shift to a higher ground seems to be against the tide.
Midday Report provides you with more than just news stories.
I just want Port Elizabeth to know that they own a world-class theatre.
Good afternoon. You're with the news at 1 in the headlines.
Very good afternoon to you. This is News Live. I'm Natasha Thorpe. Let's take a quick look at what's coming up in your headlines.
Good afternoon and welcome to A View from the House.
For all things news, tune in to Midday Report weekdays at 12 noon only on the SABC News channel.
Welcome back. You're still watching On the Record. Well, it's been one of the world's most devastating conflicts, with incalculable human losses, displacements, and all manner of damage and destruction. In the decades it's been going on, some of the world's most powerful leaders, be they politicians, artists, sportspersons, writers, have tried, needless to say, without much success, to help end the conflict. As we speak, the prospects for peace in the region are almost non-existent. Emotions continue to rise, and so do tempers from both sides of the divide. In a week, groups of South Africans devoted to the Palestinian cause are engaged in various solidarity efforts. We take the opportunity to look at whether and how each and every one of us can play our own part and help end the Israel-Palestine conflict, given our own experience with apartheid. My guests stand at opposite ends of the divide. From the South African Jews for a Free Palestine, we have Alan Howitz. Welcome, sir.
Good evening.
Mighty Jamie is from Africans for Peace. Welcome to you too, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Well, if I may start with you, Alan, why this week? And what are you asking South Africans to do this week?
I think that our experience of institutionalized apartheid, where racism is put into law and a specific group of people are discriminated against, dispossessed, culturally disenfranchised. Our experience shows us that the Israeli approach to the Palestinian minority within Israel and the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza is very similar to what existed in South Africa. There are, of course, historical differences, and the context in many senses is also different. But the fundamental definition of apartheid, of institutionalized discrimination by one group against another, in this instance on the basis of ethnicity and to some extent religion, holds true. And we believe South Africa can play a role in alerting the world to this for the sake both of Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. In the same way that white South Africans, in a perverse way, were also victims of apartheid and have been liberated by the end of apartheid, so Israeli Jews too, instead of living in a self-imposed ghetto, can become part of the greater Middle East. Notwithstanding the current problems in the Middle East, there will be a different tomorrow. So our view is that the Israeli, let's say, practice of formalized discrimination against Arabs both within Israel, the Green Line Israel, which is recognized by most countries in the world, and certainly the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, must come to an end. Regrettably, the current Israeli government and the climate amongst Israeli Jews has become more and more fascistic, more and more discriminatory. So instead of a tendency towards an open society, a pluralistic society, which Jews all over the world demand, and quite rightfully, in Israel we have a withdrawal into a new ghetto, and that is a tragedy.
Mighty?
So, in the first instance, I've been to Israel, I've been to Palestine, and I can tell you, when I was in Palestine, I realized that Christians are not allowed to participate in politics in Palestine, in the area known as Bethlehem, right? Christians used to be a majority in that particular area. They are now a minority. They've been driven out. So the idea that Palestine is this nice entity that is benevolent and is pluralistic is one that is not true. And I think also this description, what we have is this analysis that there's a fundamental apartheid state within the state of Israel. So to talk of Israel proper, I've been there. If you're an Arab, you can vote. You can live wherever you want, you can write poetry, you can be gay, right? Israel is one of the most liberal places to exist in the Middle East, the state proper as it's recognized now, right? There are challenges that exist within Gaza, there are challenges that exist within the West Bank, but it's nowhere close to a description of apartheid. Because what's happening in Gaza is that you've got a government there, right, Hamas, which doesn't recognize the state of Israel. They don't recognize it altogether. They exist to bomb the state of Israel. And the state of Israel is the size of Gauteng. You know, if you've got a guy right at the edge of Gauteng who's bombing into the middle of Johannesburg, you're going to have some concerns. I mean, Gaza is isolated on both sides by Egypt and by Israel, because both states don't recognize them as a nice state. Because, I mean, the people who are running the area called Gaza right now are very anti-Israel, right? And when we talk about the question of peace, right, it's very important to realize one thing. The name calling, the aggrandizement of allegations towards one side or the other, because what we see with this discussion is that one side is trying to claim the moral high ground. One, I don't think both sides can claim the moral high ground. I think there's a lot of conflict going on in the Middle East, right? There's Syria, there's Iraq, there's Yemen. The Middle East is not like Switzerland and the UK. It's a war zone. And we have to be honest when we talk about these places. But what we're seeing, and this is my concern when I come from Africans for Peace, is that we have dedicated time periods where one side calls the other side names. And the reality is you can't have peace when you spend all of the time off the peace table calling the other guy names. You're going around the world saying, this guy is the bad guy, this is the villain. And then off the record, you're saying, no, but we'll get to the negotiation table one day. Because what you're doing is you're eroding the goodwill that is necessary for people to get to the negotiating table. Now, as Africans, our interest is not in Israel. Is one, obviously you want peace all around the world, but we all have attachments to the Holy Land. You know, if you're a Muslim, you have attachments there. That's the third holiest Muslim site. If you're a Christian, that is the birthplace and death place of Jesus. Do you understand? And if you're Jewish, that is the home of Judaism. So everybody has an attachment to that area, and we all want peace. But there's no way of realistically achieving peace if all of the name calling keeps happening and we don't have an honest conversation. Now, just to conclude, people are using this emotional appeal in South Africa, because if you say it's apartheid, South Africans will immediately, will take up arms for anything called apartheid. But if you really look at it, the legal regime of apartheid, compared to what's happening currently in a liberal democracy called Israel, it's not honest to call it apartheid. I must say that.
Okay. Now, before we get to what both of you regard as distinguishing characteristics of each, of whether it's Israel or Palestine, and why you believe or you insist that there are similarities that can be drawn between what is happening and apartheid. But before you tell us why that is not the case, I want to ask each and every one of you very, very briefly, what are you prepared to concede as being problems, that make it difficult for other people to accept the Israeli argument?
Should I start?
Yes, I want you to start this time.
Okay, so I think fundamentally why we never really have peace in that area, and I'm going to go straight to the jugular, is the Jerusalem question. You've got two sides which both call Jerusalem their capital city. You've got two sides who have fundamentalists who both realize that that is their holy place and they want to have as much control of it as possible. So the conversations normally break down when the question comes to Jerusalem, right? Every time there's a peace talk, the conversation normally breaks down on the Jerusalem question. So until we can actually have a very difficult conversation, I think globally, around how do you navigate a city which has got three religious ties and where some of the religions aren't ready to relinquish any aspects of control of the holy sites, because that's where it breaks down. When people are beginning to think that there is a mosque on top of my wall and that was on top of my temple, and then some people are concerned that religious artifacts are being destroyed, it really becomes technical, because if I think you're going to destroy my religious artifacts, I'm going to be sensitive about you controlling the land. And if I think that it's haram for you to enter the holy space that is now controlled by my religion, I'm also going to be very reluctant to give you control over that place.
Your take, Alan?
No, I don't think it's fundamentally a religious issue. The fact is that most conflicts are about land and resources. And in this instance, Zionism, as the so-called national liberation of the Jewish people, arose because of anti-Semitism, racism in Europe. So a European problem was transferred by European Jews to the Middle East. Notwithstanding the fact that, yes, 2,000 years ago there was a Jewish presence for many generations, but the fact is that for 2,000 years another community developed there which had a very profound attachment to the land. And then in the late 1880s, with rising anti-Semitism in Europe, Zionism started to colonize what was another territory under the Turkish Empire. At the end of the First World War, the British took over, and the British then made a promise to the Jewish people that they could set up a homeland in an Arab country. So we had a fundamental contradiction.
This is not accurate at all.
And this fundamental contradiction meant in 1915, there were only 15% of the Palestinian population was Jewish. 50 years down the line, they had a change because of the Nazi Holocaust, and Jewish refugees started to illegally enter Palestine. So Palestinian Arabs saw gradually that their country was now being populated by another people and protected to some extent by foreign interests. So the crux of the conflict is about land. Today in the West Bank, there are now 500,000 Israeli settlers. They live in a parallel universe to the local Palestinian population. They have separate communities which are guarded day and night. They have separate roads. They live under the Israeli tax system, the Israeli legal system. Palestinians are under military occupation or are finished now under the Palestinian Authority, which in many respects, I must say, similar to the Bantustan system in South Africa.
Where is he wrong?
That's
Where
why
is he
we
missing
look
the
at
point?
the apartheid analogy.
So, I mean, in the first instance, the history is absolutely incorrect. The reality is, this is not a case which just rises up when there is anti-Semitism in Europe. Firstly, anti-Semitism is something that the Jewish people have experienced since the Jewish people have existed. This is how they lost the land in the first place, right? And a lot of the Palestinian Arab presence which exists now in the area called Israel, or the Levant area, came through the Ottoman Empire, who were colonizers, right? So if you trace back the history, you will find that there is archaeological remains of Jewish people within the Israeli community across the thousands of years. So whilst people were driven out, they were never fully driven out. Now, if and Julius Malema likes to make this argument, if I take your car, right, and I keep it for 100 years and I give it to my son, whose car is it, right? So the same question needs to be asked. If people are driven out of their homeland and they still want to go back to their homeland, can you say that when they come back, that now they are colonizers because they came back home? You can't say that. It's dishonest to say that. The whole nomenclature of the areas are named after Jewish names. It's not by accident. We're talking about Judea, Samaria, Bethlehem, Nazareth, because this nomenclature, the archaeology, predates the existence of the people we currently call Palestinian people. A lot of these people came through under Arab colonialism. Now, to use a similar example, if I left South Africa under apartheid and I went to Zimbabwe and I was there for 50 years, if I came back, because I was driven out of my homeland, if I came back to South Africa after 50 years, am I a colonizer if I buy a house in Sandton? I'm not. I was always South African. Right? Now, the idea that the Jewish community is this colonial settler state, because this is where the claim for apartheid is based. It's like these guys came from Europe and they took over. And that's not the truth. It's these guys were driven out of their home violently. Some of them stayed. And when they could, they eventually began to come back. Right? You can't say that people who came back are apartheid colonizers. There are people who came back. Now, the land question is a question that is essential. But there have been deals. There were land swaps under Arafat which were almost concluded, right? The question then became, what happens with Jerusalem? And it wasn't resolved. So I don't like to be insincere when I have conversations, because maybe this gentleman is a secular gentleman, you know? He doesn't care about the holy sites. He doesn't care about the mosque, third holiest site. But we can't say that is true of all people who have an interest in this thing. Do you understand? Because if you look at groups like ISIS, if you look at groups even like Hamas, a lot of them have religious fundamentalists in them who don't recognize the claims of Israel to any space for religious reasons. And those are the people who drive the tension and make it difficult for a peace deal to be made. Because when you start talking about Jerusalem, you can talk land swaps all you want, right? And people have done that. But when you start talking about Jerusalem, then the ugly starts coming out. Then the nitty-gritty starts coming out. But when you talk about the land question, it's not fair and it's not honest to describe the Jewish people as a colonial settler people. That's not true.
If I can respond, to the degree that the religious issues of Jerusalem can be solved through the internationalization of the religious sites. There's no objection, I think, from the high priests of all religions to allow access. The problem becomes when religion becomes a political football. So different interests are now using religion.
By access, you mean what exactly?
Sorry?
By access, you mean what exactly?
Access to the holy sites, so that pilgrims of any religion have got free access. And Jerusalem then could become a true city of peace for the world. Now, the fact is that the Israeli fundamentalists, the Jewish fundamentalists, and the Muslim fundamentalists are equally at fault. We've seen in the Middle East how religion has become a substitute for rational, secular thinking in terms of pluralism and an open society. That is tragic for all peoples. But to go back to your earlier point, if yes, there has been a Jewish presence in Israel-Palestine for thousands of years, but effectively effectively after the Roman occupation of Palestine 2,000 years ago, a Jewish majority was lost. Now, to say that after 2,000 years, one can return and supplant a group of people who've now lived there for generations is stretching things. I think there we'd have to look at international law and say, you know, when is there some kind of expiry, so to speak, in terms of your right to a portion of land? The fact is that anti-Semitism was essentially a European problem aggravated by the Nazi Holocaust. Now, in terms of the current situation, there certainly have to be certain compromises. There are roughly 6 million Palestinian Arabs, both in Israel, so to speak, and the occupied territories, and roughly 6 million Israeli Jews. Neither community is going to disappear. What we need then is a society based on equality in terms of both personal liberty and national ethnic fulfillment.
Okay. So I want to ask you to hold your thoughts right there, both of you gentlemen. We're going to take a quick ad break. When we continue with tonight's debate, I want us to talk about going forward solutions. What can each and every one of us do to help create peaceful conditions in that part of the world? That's after this short break.
A romantic adventure film starring Ivan Buerta and Donnelly Roberts. The story begins in the beautiful vineyards of Paarl in the Western Cape. The adventure takes off when the characters find themselves on the tropical island of Love, Mauritius.
Josephine's work is more interesting and distinguishable. She visits war-stricken zone countries to tell the story of the damage war often leaves behind.
In this particular exhibition's case, places that are named after conflict or disaster or war or reconciliation.
And basically what it is it's a collection of the best animated short films from around the world this year. And the idea is to inspire animators and directors with this exciting content. And so that's been offered to us as a cinema, and we're very excited to be screening the animated show of shows here in South Africa.
Join Refulo Mulwa for that 1 hour weekly dose of arts and entertainment news every Friday at 9 p.m. on Trends.
Preparing for victory requires intense effort and teamwork. When you get to it, there is no turning back, because all eyes are on you. When it's action time, nothing should stand in your way. Sports Live tackles and analyzes all the sport action. This is the home of all your sport news, updates and more. Sports Live weekdays at 8:30 p.m.
Welcome back. You're watching On The Record. Well, this week, groups of South Africans involved, devoted to the Palestinian cause, are engaged in various solidarity efforts, and we on the program are taking the opportunity to look at whether and how each and every one of us can play our own part and help end the Israel-Palestine conflict, given, of course, our own experiences with apartheid. If I may start with you, Mighty, this time around. I guess everyone professes or says they want peace, and that's the ultimate goal that everyone is working towards, irrespective of whether we share perspectives, historical perspectives, that is. The question, I guess, is whether, given everything that is happening right now, the peace that has eluded that part of the world, is possible anytime soon.
You know what? I think one of the most tricky problems we have with achieving peace is that the parties who are supposed to have this conversation seem to have in an irretrievable breakdown of goodwill. So I think it's just difficult. It's like, how do you get the two kids in the room to have the tough conversation? You know, when I was a kid, when me and my cousin had a fight, my mom would force us to forgive each other. And we never really liked it at the time, but after, you know, a few minutes we'd be over it. But here you've got a situation where everybody's been angry for decades now, you know. People still don't recognize each other. Some organizations don't recognize Israel at all. And you have fundamentalist groups which are unwilling to negotiate. So it becomes very tricky to see what the starting point is. And a lot of times you have conflicted third parties, you know, such as the American state, who aren't really always viewed as being impartial. So I think if the world could find a way of creating a realistic timeline where we could begin to have codessas for Israel, real codessas, where there is an obligation to come out with some outcomes, and then there be commitments imposed on both sides for them to meet the requirements. So if we were looking for circular states of let's say you were talking about Gaza and the West Bank, with a corridor perhaps between the two of them, and then that's one state, and then Israel being another state, or various formulations of that. If they're all going to be circular, the adoption of circular principles within those democracies across the board. But it's looking really difficult right now because of the attrition, so to speak, between the parties.
Okay. In your analysis, what's making it difficult for peace to be attained?
I think that the key issue is that Israeli Jews must give up this dream of an Israeli state from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, the greater Israel dream, which is driving the 500,000 settlers on the West Bank.
Is that what, in your view, is the fundamental to peace?
The motor of Zionism has been expansion, has been aggrandizement of more and more Palestinian land and resources, control of the land and the water reserves. So essentially, until there's a recognition that Palestinian Arabs are co-inhabitants of that area, either to create one single society like South Africa, we have a Bill of Rights, we have equal rights for each citizen. In Israel, there is discrimination against Palestinian Arabs. I, as a Jewish South African, can claim Israeli citizenship immediately, whereas a Palestinian refugee from 1948 or from 1967 is denied access to Israel, never mind citizenship. The Jewish National Fund has in its constitution an exclusion of the right of Palestinian Israelis to either lease or buy land. And the Jewish National Fund controls over 70% of the state land, or the so-called absentee land, which was claimed when Palestinians were forced to evacuate 500 villages in 1948. So Israeli Jews have to understand that they must become partners in a common society, as we in South Africa have settled to some extent. We know the economic disparities in our society, but at least now there is formal legal equality, and there's a movement to address the economic inequalities.
Well, in the absence of that, of the world, you know, doing or playing the role that you had suggested, would you or the people you know have an objection to what Alan's saying?
So, I mean, Alan has given us some problematic facts in the first instance. I mean, a lot of people use this description of Zionism like it's a boogeyman. Do you understand? Zionism is actually more benign than some of the propaganda that comes from Hamas and those kind of guys. Zionism is like Africanism. Jewish people believe that they deserve a state which they can exist in and self-determine in. It's the same as black people saying that we deserve a continent where we can exist and self-determine in, or South Africans saying South Africa is our land and it belongs to South Africans, right? Jewish people have a legitimate claim to a land, as do Palestinian people. A lot of people think that if you are pro-Israel, that means you're anti-Palestine. You can be pro-both. Now, to discuss some of the issues he's raised, I mean, if you're talking about 500,000 people who are living within what is known as the West Bank right now, he's just told us there's 6 million Jewish people, closer to 7 actually, who are regarded as Israeli citizens. 500,000 is a minority right? We can remove those people if that's the deal breaker. But one of the big issues, I'm just talking from my position as an African for peace. I don't think removing 500,000 people is a train smash. I do think a bigger train smash is when the organizations who are running Gaza and the West Bank don't recognize Israel. Do you understand? When people say we don't recognize your right to have a state of your own, it's similar to saying to black people, we don't recognize your claim to Africa because we're all from Africa.
Why are we nodding, Alan?
No, I think you've agreed with me that the Israeli settlers on the West Bank are probably the biggest single stumbling block.
No, the biggest stumbling block in my view is a failure to recognize
If I could
Israel.
Finish, please. I would agree with you that on the Palestinian side, particularly the religious fundamentalists, there is a problem. That grouping of people too is not open to accommodating other views and other people.
What would it take them to do that?
I think that Israel is the fourth most powerful military force in the world. Israel has 300 nuclear weapons. Israel is in a sense militarily invincible, although of course the balance of power can change. The longer that Israelis, and Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, is on record as saying Israelis must live by the sword, that there is no chance of accommodating Palestinian aspirations.
Well, we can't
sorry if I can finish, please. Netanyahu has said to Israeli Jews, you will fight forever. Why? Because we are not part of the Middle East. We cannot accommodate, as I say, Palestinian aspirations. Israel is part of FIFA, but part of the European League, which is nonsensical. So the attitude of Israelis has to change and become part of the Middle East. And there, I think, is the crux. The refugee problem. Sorry, my last point. The Palestinian refugee problem. Israel has never put on the table, in concrete terms, yes, we recognize there was a catastrophe for Palestinians, what is called the Nakba, in 1948, when there was ethnic cleansing from 500 villages. Those villages largely have been destroyed. Israel must take responsibility and say, a return of some people, reparations for others, but look at it in concrete terms. Those issues are pushed to the side. So the extremists on the Palestinian side, in the sense of those who want everything, because when either side wants everything, then there's going to be continuing conflict.
But you haven't. But where would the are the Palestinians prepared to make some concessions, for example?
Well,
on what?
The fact is that Mahmoud Abbas, the current president of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, his security forces are assisting the Israelis to try and cut down on what we call terroristic attacks. So the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank certainly has said, let us negotiate. John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, spent 8 months trying to broker a peace. And by all accounts, on the Israeli side, intransigence relating to territorial compromise, the rights of Palestinians, and the return of refugees or some settlement was the breaker of those negotiations. So
what
really the stronger force, Israel, is responsible for the breakdown.
Let me just chip in here. Look, I think something very dishonest has happened in this debate. You know, Jacob Zuma is a South African, right? Arguably, he's done some bad things. If Jacob Zuma thinks that you should take a shower after having sex, that doesn't mean that every South African thinks that. So to say one guy, Netanyahu, said some problematic things and to ascribe that to 6 million Israelis as if they had a meeting and they sent him out to say specifically those things is problematic. The Jewish community does have different political views about how to resolve this issue, right? So you can't quote Netanyahu and act like Netanyahu speaks for all of Israel. Right, so that's the first thing. Now, there are some problems, right, around refugees and stuff like that. The problem is different sides are talking about different things. On one side will claim that there's 6 million refugees, right? On the other side, the number is probably closer to 1 million who can actually prove that they were in Israel at the time. Now, the reference is made in a dodgy way because in 1948, what happened is that Israel was attacked by Middle Eastern countries. And this is why sometimes Israel doesn't describe itself as Middle Eastern. And the whole Middle Eastern question is problematic because Egypt is Middle Eastern,
but
right?
Then it's the view of the current head of state in Israel that peace is not possible anytime in the near future. I spoke to Shimon Peres only a week ago, and he was saying he differs with him fundamentally on that.
There you go.
And he doesn't think that there seems to be. So no, what I'm saying is whether it's Netanyahu or in other words, Netanyahu is not the only one who was actually...
Look, I mean, what you're saying is just like saying people will say South Africa has got problems, and some people will say South Africa is going to be fine. You know, people are pulling out Barclays, whatever. Some people will say South Africa is doomed, and other people will say South Africa is hopeful, right? That's any situation. You're going to have any situation where people are like, and the people who say they don't see that peace is possible are the people who have to deal every day with the fact that they're being attacked by Gaza and their missiles being fired, and people are being given propaganda saying that there's no state of Israel.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for coming. Unfortunately, we have to end it right here. Thanks to both of you for coming. Hopefully, this debate will not end here tonight. But that's all we have for you tonight. From me, Vuyo Mvoko, and the rest of the team, it's a goodbye. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time.